Alright, so in this video we're going to learn how to create, edit, and delete objects in Nautobot using API calls. So in order to manage those API calls, we're going to use a VS Code extension called Thunder Client. So within Thunder Client, I've already installed it, but within Thunder Client, what I've gone ahead and done is created a new collection called Nautobot. So within Nautobot, to get started, let's go ahead and create a new request. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to start off with creating a new tenant in Nautobot. And we're also going to be using the demo Nautobot server that's available via the internet. So when we create this request, let's just call it create a tenant. And so to start off, let's just get the basic settings configured for our API call. So to start off, we're going to go ahead and start off with a GET request, just so we can test this out. And the URL is going to be https demo.nautobot.com. And then for the API, we're going to say /API, and then the app name within Nautobot, and the app is called tenancy, and then the actual resource we want to manipulate. So we'll say tenants. So now we have our method and our URL configured. Let's go ahead and configure our headers. So we'll start off with the accept header. We'll set that to application /JSON. And then for the second header, let's do the content type header. And we'll set this to application JSON as well. And so in general, these two headers are a good baseline for any API call that you make. The content type header is not always required, but it's just best practice. And then for the third header, we're going to use the authorization header. And this is the header that we're actually going to use to authenticate to the Nautobot API. And for Nautobot, we're going to have to say token space, and then we're going to have to specify an API token that's tied to a user in Nautobot that has permissions to create, edit, and delete devices. So in the demo Nautobot server, I've already logged in with the default demo user, but if you haven't logged in, they have the default username and password available for you in the banner. So after you've logged in, go ahead and hit your drop down underneath the user, and then hit profile. And then you're going to hit this API tokens tab. And then here you can see they've already created a token for us. It's just a long string of A's. And then you see it was created in March, and then it never expires. And then you can see it even has create, edit, and delete operations enabled. So that works out perfect. So let's go ahead and copy that token and then put it in our request. So we'll put it right there. And so now if we go ahead and send this API call, we have successfully pulled all the tenants. So now let's go ahead and get started with creating a new tenant. So typically when you're creating a new object, you're going to use a post request. Again, it all depends on the destination API. But I just know for a fact that in Nautobot's case, we want to send a post request. So if we go ahead and send a post request to that same URL, let's see what happens. So we actually get a response back that says that the name field is required. So what we can do is we can go to the body tab over here, and this is where we can actually pass data to the server in our API call. So we can enter it in JSON, XML, GraphQL, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and build out our JSON data. So we're just going to start off with a curly brace, and then we'll say a name, and we'll just call it some new tenant. And now if we hit send, you can see it actually created an object, and it passed back some of the other fields that it created for us. So it created the slug field for us, the date it was created, last updated, the display name. And then it also gives us this specific URL that we can use to manage that individual tenant. And you can see it's just the same URL we have right now, so API tenancy tenants, but at the very end, it's actually appended the object's unique ID. So let's go ahead and copy that, because next what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and edit that new tenant that we created. But before we do that, I'll go ahead and show you in the GUI. So if we go to organization and then tenants, you can see that our new tenant has popped up. So now let's create a new request to actually edit that existing tenant. So let's go ahead and duplicate this request, and we'll call this edit a tenant. And so now in this one, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and paste in that URL, just like that. Because if we want to edit or delete an existing object, we have to specify the object's unique ID in the URL itself. And now since we're editing the object, we're actually going to set the method to patch. And now in the JSON body, we could just specify, what we want to change. So actually, if we just do a GET request, so these are all the fields that we can edit. So let's actually change this back to a patch, and then we'll change one of these things. So let's add some comments. And now if we hit send, you can see it worked, and now we get the appropriate return data. And now if we go back into Nautobot and check out our new tenant, you can see in the comments we have hello world. And so now, like I said before, if we want to edit or delete an existing object, we have to use the object's unique ID in the URL. But now that we already have that URL, what we can do is let's go ahead and create another request. So we'll go ahead and duplicate this, and we'll call this one delete a tenant. And so now we're just going to change the method to a delete, and then hit send. And we don't get anything back, but if you look at the status, we get a status 204, no content. In general, any status code that begins with a 2 means successful. So just because we didn't get anything back doesn't mean that it didn't work. So 204 is actually a success. So now if we go back to our tenants list in Nautobot, you can see it's now gone. And that's the basics of creating, editing, and deleting an object. So let's try and do the same thing with a device. So let's add a new request. Actually, before we do that, let's just duplicate one of the other ones. And let's go ahead and create some folders within this Nautobot collection. We'll move all the tenant API calls to the tenants folder. And let's create a new folder called devices as well. Cool. So now if we open our request, so since we're creating an object, we'll set the method to post. For the URL, it's going to be API / the application name within Nautobot. So for devices, the app name is going to be called DCIM, and then the actual resource we're manipulating is just devices. So we'll go ahead and test this out with a GET request. Cool, so that worked just fine. So let's actually go ahead and add a parameter to this API call to only pull devices from the AMS01 site. So if we go ahead and hit the query tab, and we'll say we want this site equals AMS01. Cool. So now we have the data for 11 devices that belong in that AMS01 site in Nautobot. So what we're going to do now is let's actually I'm going to rename this. Let's call this pull devices. Then we'll duplicate it. All right, so let's get rid of this parameter really quick. And then, so as before, if we want to create an object, we have to set the method to post. So let's go ahead and send that and see what happens. So it gives us 4 fields that are required. So in addition to these 4 fields, we're also going to set the name. So let's go to our body tab. We'll set the name to my new device. And then device type. We'll just do empty strings for right now. We'll go ahead and set the site to AMS01. And then the status, I just know off the top of my head, can be active. So we'll say the status is active, all lowercase, just like that. So unfortunately, we can't just put the name of the site in the field right here. Whenever we want to specify a related object, we actually need to use that object's unique ID. So what we actually need is the ID of the AMS01 site. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to this API call that we executed before, and we're going to look in the data and find the ID of the AMS01 site. So if we scroll down, we'll look for the site. Right here. So we see site, and then within the site, we see the ID and the URL, so on and so forth. But this is the actual ID of the AMS01 site. So we'll go ahead and copy that and go back to our other API call and put that in quotes, just like that. And we need to do the same thing for device type and device role. So again, we're really just copying these parameters from an existing device to make it easy. So for device role, we have the ID. And now we just got to do device type. So device type, ID. All right, so now if we hit send. So, okay, so this is actually a Nautobot thing. So one thing Nautobot allows you to do is specify a device naming convention. And they're basically saying that the name that we provided does not match that convention. So we'll take a look at this right now. So it's going to be basically like the site, a number identifier, the description, and then a unique or an individual instance of that object. So under the name, let's go ahead and do something like their example. So we'll say AAA 00 my new device, and then 01. Let's try that. Does not work. All right, let's try without underscores. All right, so we finally got something to work. There was something wrong with my naming convention. But you can see now that the name conforms to their naming standard that they implemented in Nautobot, we actually have return data for that new object that we created. So again, I just wanted to run you through that to show you that we really have to specify the unique ID for any related objects, right? So the related device type, device role, and site all needed those unique IDs. So now what we can do is if we want to edit this individual device, we need to go ahead and copy the ID. So now let's go ahead and create a new request. And we'll call this edit a device. And since we're editing an existing object, we're going to set this to patch. And now we can go ahead and change the name. Now, before I do that, let's go ahead and look at it in Nautobot. So go to devices. Actually, let's go to sites. AMS01. Devices. And then you can see there's that device we just created. So now let's go ahead and edit it. We'll change the, let's see, what do we want to edit? Let's just add a serial number to make it simple. So in the JSON content, all we need to do is specify what we want to change. So serial, we'll set this to 4 ones. And then in our actual URL, we need to, oops, I'm on the wrong request. Sorry. So in our data, let me fix that. And then since we're editing an existing device, we need that device's ID. So we'll add that to the URL. And now if we hit send, we get the data back. And if we go down to serial, we now see it has 4 ones for the serial number. So now same thing for delete. I'm not going to create a new request for this. We'll just go ahead and set this to delete. And then the JSON data doesn't matter for a delete. Just hit send. Cool. We get a status 204 back, no content. And now if we go back to the devices from that site, we should see that our device is now gone, which it is. So that's essentially how you create, edit, and delete objects in Nautobot. Again, the way we did it here is just how Nautobot was designed. Every API that you hit is going to be slightly different. They do tend to conform to RESTful standards, but just keep in mind you're going to have to read the documentation. Also, normally a well-defined website is going to have what's called Swagger documentation. And Swagger is a tool for automatically creating API documentation. So basically, with Swagger, you can build out the actual API, and Swagger can essentially create the documentation for you based on what you've created. And right now, the demo Nautobot server's Swagger documentation isn't working. Otherwise, I would show you. But Swagger documentation is a very handy resource when you're trying to figure out what API calls to accomplish what tasks. Okay, so just kind of recap over a couple things we did. If you're going to create a new object in Nautobot, you want to use a post request. If you're going to edit an object, you're going to use a patch request. And then, to delete an object, you're going to use a delete request. Anytime you want to send data to the server, you're going to put it in the body. And normally you're going to pass that as JSON content. And then if you want to, well, with Nautobot specifically, when you're editing an object, and you need to assign fields that are related objects in Nautobot, like site, device type, device role, just keep in mind that you're going to have to use that object's unique ID. And so typically, in order to get that unique ID, you won't really be able to see that in the GUI on Nautobot. So what you're going to have to do is typically you're going to have to go ahead and run other API calls to get the unique ID for that object. Anyway, that's all I have. I appreciate you watching the video, and I hope you have a good one.